Hello, economics students. In this video, we're going to look at one market-based environmental policy. And just like we did with trade liberalization, we need to think about both the short-term and its long-term impact on these things: intertemporal efficiency, aggregate supply, and living standards. So I'm not going to bang on too much about climate because I know you're sick of me talking about it in class, but we do have this phenomenon called climate change. The planet's getting warmer, and we need to think about the impacts of this on the Australian economy and its ability and willingness to produce. So, if you think about the acidification of the ocean and the destruction of our Great Barrier Reef and maybe other ocean life, how does that affect tourism in Australia, which is a big industry, and the businesses there and their ability and willingness to produce? What about changes in rainfall and the increased frequency and severity of weather patterns like fires and floods and droughts? Well, that hurts our farmers' ability and willingness to produce because they have unstable weather patterns, and it just makes it harder for them to get their crops or to look after their animals. And so, climate is bad for not just the environment, obviously, but it's also bad for the economy. So, what are we going to do about it? There are three ways, and although it's not your fault, it is your job to try and fix it. It's our generation's job to kind of try and fix it. There are three ways that we're going to study or we're going to look at. In fact, only one, but there's three that you can look at that will help solve this climate issue. So, first of all, the first one is about emissions trading. Now, it's called a cap and trade scheme or emissions trading scheme. It just involves creating a market for carbon, and businesses will trade that carbon. In Australia, we have what's called a carbon offset scheme, which is just a voluntary version of this, which is pretty silly if you ask me. And the other one you could look at is called a carbon tax, which is where you just do an old-fashioned excise tax on suppliers. Supply will shift to the left, and the price will go up, and there'll be less carbon emitted into the environment. Now, remember that all these are supposed to be market-based, which just involves creating a price for carbon. Now, at the moment, there is no price for carbon that firms need to bear, even though it's the cause of climate change. So in Victoria, remember that we burn a lot of dirty brown coal. It releases carbon dioxide into the environment, which is bad and creates this climate change issue that we've been talking about. So, how do we make sure that firms have to account for their negative externalities? Well, we create a market. So, an emissions trading scheme is just where the government issues these things called carbon credits. Now, they limit the amount of carbon credits, which is why it's called a cap, because they want to limit the amount of carbon that businesses and households release into the environment. So, they'll limit the amount of carbon credits that they issue, and you can only release carbon into the environment if you have one of these carbon credits. Otherwise, it's illegal. So, what does this do? Well, firms now have an incentive to use less carbon emission activities, right? They now have a financial incentive because they have to pay for the right to emit carbon. So they'll transition to greener energies. They'll use less electricity. And if you think about it, there's two incentives going on here. On the one hand, if you have to pay to emit carbon, you're likely to want to stop doing it. But on the other hand, if you're able to sell your carbon credits, if you have credits left over, there's also an incentive not to do it so that you can sell these back to other producers. So the idea is that our high carbon emitting businesses have to buy from our low carbon emitting businesses. Now, the government does set a target based on their broader emissions target. So we have net zero by 2050. That just means by 2050, we want to remove every bit of carbon that we release into the environment, we want to remove it, which means that in net terms, it's 0%. Now, the main job here is you could draw this on an aggregate, demand and supply diagram. So we have a vertical supply line, and demand comes from businesses for carbon credits. If carbon demand goes up, well, the price of carbon credits will go up, and vice versa. And if the government wanted to cut emissions, they would shift supply to the left by decreasing the supply of carbon credits. But you don't really need to do that. What you really need to know is the impacts of an ETS in the short term on aggregate supply. And there are some costs in the short term, because if you think about it, if businesses now need to pay for their carbon emissions, so Origin Energy, I believe, is the owner of the coal-fired power plant in the Latrobe Valley, if they now have to pay biocarbon credits or pay a carbon tax, their cost of production is going to go up. Now, all other businesses in Victoria, they need electricity, and Origin's going to pass the increased cost of production onto them in the form of higher electricity prices. And in the short term, that's just going to restrict aggregate supply growth. It's going to restrict our ability and willingness to produce, and it will decrease international competitiveness. Remember, not every country has an ETS. I think only New Zealand and a couple in Europe. There's also a decrease in productivity. So in the short term, as resources allocated away, there may be some wastage. So in the short term, it's kind of bad for the economy and bad for aggregate supply, but it does start to improve intertemporal efficiency. All right, if we think about it on living standards, well, there are some people that might lose their job as this power plant in the Latrobe Valley starts to transition away from coal. People are going to lose their jobs, and that is bad for their living standards in the short term. But you could argue that the non-material living standards improve as people are less anxious about climate change. But in the long term, as all aggregate supply policies do, we will see benefits in the long term. So to the extent that a carbon tax or an ETS, whichever policy you focus, reduces carbon emissions into the environment and therefore improves or decreases the impact of climate change, we have environmental stability. And that means that it's much easier for the people working on the Barrier Reef, all the farmers in Australia to produce. And so we would say there's an increase in the ability and willingness to produce, or an increase in aggregate supply. Okay. And on a more broader picture, well, we need continued access to our environment if we want to produce anyway. So you can think about farmers specifically or just much more broadly. It also continues to improve intertemporal efficiency as we continue to balance out today's needs with the future. Those people in the short term who might have lost their job because they were working at the coal mine can now transition to more greener industries, solar, wind, hydrogen, maybe even nuclear, and that will improve their material living standards in the longer term. All right, well done. You made it to the end of the course. I hope you found these videos helpful. If you did, I just ask for one thing in return, and that is that you share them with someone else you might think will find these helpful. Good luck for your exam. And for the last time, bye for now. Feel free to email me if you have any questions.